Hello, welcome to the Social Impact Journal. I'm Jack Farron, your host. Today we have a very exciting episode. This is episode 13 with Jerioth Mwaura, the future of work in Africa. And here is the trailer.
Statistics say about 1 in 5 young Africans are not in employment, education, or training. I do believe that the biggest resource that we have as Africa is human talent. So it's quite unfortunate that a lot of people are unable to put their skill and talent into good use. Our economies in Africa are not generating enough opportunities for the bulging youth population. And therefore, digital technology creates an opportunity to lower those barriers. Africa needs to create more than 10 million jobs if it's going to close the unemployment gap. Gig workers are, continuously undercutting themselves and undercutting others. Willing to work for less just to ensure that they're able to secure that.
Welcome, Jerioth, to the Social Impact Journal today. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, good to have you on. So you're in Nairobi right now?
Yes, I am. Cold, June, coldness in Nairobi, but yes, excited to be here.
Good stuff, good stuff. I'm still in Kampala and the rain was coming down this morning. It's the first major rain, but I'm still having the aircon on in the office. It's still too warm for me.
Right.
Great. So before we get into what I think is going to be a really, really interesting discussion today, I would love to understand how you got to this point and some of your career highlights.
Yeah, I started my career in management consulting for about 5 years. I was working with social entrepreneurs in East and Southern Africa, supporting them to develop growth strategies, to expand to new markets, and to get investor ready and raise funding from private equity firms. I then transitioned into development, which was an interesting, I think, journey switch, coming from helping social entrepreneurs raise funding to then being a grant maker and giving grant funding to mostly technology-based social enterprises in East Africa. Did that for about 4 years. And that was a very interesting role. The highlight of that being working with very many social enterprises that were focused on finding ways for technology to help solve, some of the most pertinent social challenges, including youth unemployment. I got to work with quite a number of gig platforms that were, trying out, designing, piloting, and scaling solutions that, have really impacted the youth and employment landscape in East Africa. So I was really excited to do that. I got a bit of a career break, went back to school, and then now moved to another grant making role, and more focused on digital innovation this time around, and with a bigger scope, focusing more on the global South. So that is in addition to Africa, also South Asia.
Thanks so much. And you touched on youth unemployment, and I know Africa has the youngest population in the world. So how severe is youth unemployment in the continent right now?
Oh, it is a big pandemic. It's a big challenge. I think former statistics say about 1 in 5 young Africans are not in employment, education, or training. And that is a former statistic. I think the challenge is much bigger than that because, even just only taking statistics from Kenya, where 80% of the employed, so this is the small percentage that are actually employed in the informal sector, which means as much as they would be counted by census as being employed, the income is not stable. It is not guaranteed that the following day that they will have a job, and the income is very low. So for most young people in Africa, they don't leave, university or whatever form of education they're in, knowing that there's a guarantee that they will get a job. All the statistics were saying, it takes up to 5 years for a university graduate to get a job that is relevant to what they have studied. So it's a huge problem. It's a huge, I would almost waste of the African potential. I do believe that the biggest resource that we have as Africa is human talent. So it's quite unfortunate that a lot of people are unable to put their skill and talent into good use to grow the economies of the countries that they live in.
Well, one thing you mentioned there, 5 years it would take a university graduate on average to secure a job that's relevant to their field. So let's just say straight out of university, what would be a typical job someone may go into if they've got a degree in, let's say, economics or business, before they take that many years to find a job in their field? Where could they go?
First in Kenya, we are known for freelancing. Most university students, are known to be doing a lot of online jobs as they study, and that is a good fallback plan for most students even after they graduate. But everything from informal jobs to starting your own hustle, having a hustle in Kenya, and by hustle I mean like a small business that you're able to do, whether it's trading or upselling things that are able to give you something to do, is very common. Agriculture is still the biggest employer and the biggest source of income for most families. So most people, resort to going back to their homes and participating in agriculture with the rest of their family as they look and hope and send CVs to 1,000,001 places, hoping to secure something more permanent.
Thanks so much. And you seem to have a very rich experience of supporting technology-based social enterprises and ventures. So how do you see tech in helping and to address the unemployment challenges on the continent right now?
Yeah, if you think about fundamentally what is causing unemployment, what is causing so many people who are skilled, able, energetic to not have gainful employment, it is because it's a supply issue. Our economies in Africa are not generating enough opportunities for the bulging youth population. And therefore, digital technology creates an opportunity to lower those barriers, to say that just because I am based in Kenya doesn't mean I am only limited to looking for employment opportunities in Kenya. I can work in the UK, I can work in the US, I can work remotely for companies in other countries that have a job, have a worker shortage. And so that's the first thing. So first, digital technology has lowered the geographical barriers and the physical barriers that have made young people unable to find employment opportunities. But also even looking at it from a gender lens, because unemployment is bad in Africa, but it's even worse for women in Africa because of also skill gaps, but also gender and societal norms that have locked women out of the workplace. But then digital platforms help close those barriers, because it really doesn't matter who I am and my physical abilities when I'm doing a job on a digital platform. It also helps me as a woman be able to balance, but get a better work-life balance. For most women that have been surveyed, when they talk about why wouldn't you go and find a particular kind of job, they say, I need to be home in time to take care of my family, to take care of the household chores. And therefore, a digital platform also closes that barrier when it comes to time, where, especially if you're working remotely, you can choose your hours, you can choose the hours that work for you and still be able to balance it with other responsibilities that you may have as a woman. So it is digital platforms have created great opportunities to leapfrog, where there were statistics, I think, a few years ago that were saying, Africa needs to create more than 10 million jobs if it's going to close the unemployment gap. And so as economies were already grappling with how do we leapfrog that and create that many jobs in such a short time, then digital platforms then create opportunities to say, you're no longer limited by space, you're no longer limited by geography, you're no longer limited even by skill. So the world is your oyster, and as a young person, you can find a job anywhere and work at any time. So it's definitely one of the more important tools that Africa is using to leapfrog the challenge.
Oh, okay. So with the growth of those digital platforms and the gig economy, there are of course challenges that arise for young people in Africa. So from the research that you've done in your experience, what are the key challenges you're seeing with the growth of the gig economy?
So as I said, gig economy is great because of the flexibility it brings the worker. In its core definition, it's independent work that is paid per task. But also, if you look at that definition, then you realize that there are challenges that almost automatically come with that kind of job, which is, as much as it is independent, it also means that you lack all the safety nets of a full-time employment opportunity. It means that your employer first does not have a contract with you, and therefore you are not guaranteed of a stable income. You're not guaranteed you're going to have a job tomorrow. There are no laws. Most labor laws do not extend to gig work, to gig workers, and therefore, an employer can decide to underpay you. An employer can decide not to pay you tomorrow. An employer does not have to provide all the other work benefits such as sick leave, unemployment leave, health insurance that other typical full-time employees would typically get. And therefore, that balance of independence and flexibility versus the precariousness that comes with choosing a path of employment that lacks all the safety nets that labor unions over many decades have fought for and been able to secure for workers, puts workers in a very precarious place. And I think this challenge is especially difficult for Africa because already our labor laws are not very strong. Workers are already not paid very well, but also there is a high supply of labor, and therefore, for workers you would easily say, if it's not a good job, walk away and find something else. They do not have that bargaining power. They do not have. They cannot just walk away. And therefore, it has ended up being a race to the bottom, where gig workers are, continuously undercutting themselves and undercutting others, willing to work for less, just to ensure that they're able to secure that, willing to risk their lives and to even work jobs that do not have any sort of safety. Guarantees just to make sure that they are able to secure that income. And so it is the gig economy, as much as it has been brought forward, especially for Africa, as a solution to youth unemployment, it really has not come with the guardrails that it should have come with, and therefore it has ended up being a pathway for African workers to continue being oppressed, for African workers to continue being underpaid, And what is coming of, after, a few years of this experiment, I like calling it an experiment, being done, is that we are not seeing the economic growth from an individual perspective that we would have anticipated. If you look at literature that was coming in, like a decade ago, they were saying, all you need is technology. All you need is to put a mobile phone in a worker's hand. All you need is internet, and then automatically and magically, this poverty issue in Africa is going to be resolved. But what we have seen is working poor. People who are working poor. You wake up in the morning, you put in the hours, you work really hard, but you're still poor. You're still living paycheck to paycheck. You're still, and especially this was true during COVID. If you do not wake up the following day and find a gig, you have no fallback plan. You don't have savings. You don't have insurance, and that precariousness is not sustainable in the sense that it's not going to give Africa the economic growth and the empowerment that was initially envisioned as all this talk and push for digital growth was initially introduced.
Wow. So I know you moved to the UK for a master's degree in Manchester, University of Manchester, to dive into these topics more and to research into the gig economy. So what specifically did you research on? And what have you found out from that research in terms of the challenges of the gig economy?
Yeah, I mean, I had to focus on gig economy. It was already a topic that was really close to my heart. And so an opportunity to work with renowned professors who had also been researching the gig economy in Africa extensively was a great opportunity. And specifically my research looked at the why. So why are we seeing digital platforms resulting in inequality? And specifically, the perspective I chose to take from my research was not so much is gig economy good or bad? Is gig economy in itself going to help? But it's more of like looking at how the platforms have been designed, and knowing very well that we always see like the reports coming and saying like gig economy is a big economy. They were talking about over $200 billion economy, right? So we have big platforms making a lot of profit from the gig economy or working with gig workers. But that is not translating into the workers' well-being. So what in it inherently in its design is making that to be the case. And it's not one platform, because if it's one platform, you can say, oh, it's one badly designed platform. But across board, when you look at ride hailing, when you look at freelancing platforms, when you look at very many big tech that have primarily gone to find labor in Africa for gig workers for some of their work. Across board, we get the same challenges. We get the same feedback that workers are underpaid, that workers are not protected, that workers are not, at the end of the day, not making as much from these platforms as much as they are making such huge profits. And that inequality in the design was what I sought to look at. Why have they been designed like that? And first, it's a narrative. It's a narrative issue. Africa has been positioned for a very long time as the source of cheap labor. And this is, dating back to the days of slavery, where that was primarily the hours of an African worker were not valued or are not valued as much, right? And so, and we have contributed, and I'm saying we as an African, we have contributed to this narrative. When you look at even our governments, when they're going to negotiate with this superpowers, they're going and saying, hey, why not bring those jobs to Kenya? Why not bring those jobs to Africa? our minimum wage is much lower than the minimum wage of the US. As much as you're going to do, the African worker is going to be doing the same job, the same, quality of work. You're expecting the same quality of work as you would expect from a US worker or a UK worker. You can pay an African worker much less, and that is the business case that we are bringing to the table. And so at the point of negotiation from a macroeconomic level, already it's being negotiated the narrative of come here for cheap labor. All right. And then when the platforms come to Africa and they already engage African workers, then African workers are already by design, undercutting themselves. Especially now I'm looking at platforms where the worker actually sets the price, right? So the worker, we've already seen from research, they would go and look at the platform and say everybody else is charging $5 for this particular task, I'm going to charge $4. So the workers are already undercutting themselves, which is already it's mostly a supply issue. It's also a skill gap issue where, from the research, it's seen that most workers, especially on this international platforms, are really not going for the very high-end jobs, high-skilled jobs. Most of them are competing at the very low skill and almost entry-level kind of jobs where there's really huge supply. And so there's already a skill issue about, how much skill do you have? How much are you willing to price? What is your bargaining power? I talked about labor laws. I talked about, for example, in Kenya, labor, the minimum wage is about much less than $13. So I'm going to say with the exchange rate, it's much, much lower than $10 an hour. Not an hour, a day. So if you think about that, it means like even already from whoever is making policies, they've already decided, Kenyan worker, you can live with as little as possible, you don't have to ask for so much. And so the policies that are being put out there, we are incentivizing as many digital platforms to come to Africa and to work with workers here, because we want to solve this unemployment challenge, but we are not incentivizing them to pay workers, or at least requiring them by law to pay workers a decent income and provide any form of social protection. So there's already a policy gap. There's a worker bargaining issue that is mostly driven by oversupply of particular skills. There's a macroeconomic issue, and already that is almost decided from a geopolitical standpoint. And so when we were looking at the design, we're also looking at how does labor versus capital decide on how profits are going to be distributed. Okay, so when we were in the research looking at a platform and how a platform decides the business model, they decide in order for a consumer, in order to increase, for most of them, it's all about profits, about increasing the number of customers that are coming to that platform. I'm going to give an example of a ride-hailing app. So if I want as many people to come and use my ride-hailing app as possible. In order to do that, I want to give them as low price as possible. I want to be competitive. I would like you to come from point A to point B, paying, as little as possible. What does that translate to? It doesn't, in most cases, it doesn't translate into a lower profit for the platform. They're mostly taking a very, 10%, 15% of the ride, of the cost of the ride. What they mean is that you're just going to pay the driver much less. Okay. And in that design, they are not taking into account that this driver, who's probably taking only 80 to 85% of the cost of that ride is also paying for the fuel, which keeps on increasing. Is also paying for the cost of servicing the car. Is also paying for probably a loan that they took to purchase that car. So that whole amount is also not there. So the research that we did on ride-hailing apps, we show that the driver is taking less than 10% of whatever the cost per ride is. And comparing that, the interesting thing was comparing how those platforms, ride-hailing platforms, work in Africa, and then comparing to the same platforms and how they work in a market like the UK. You see, because of the labor laws, because of the minimum wage policies, they're not using the same policies, right? The price of moving from a kilometer in the UK versus what you would be charged moving a kilometer in Kenya is extremely different. When you look at the algorithms and how those were calculated, there's much more protection. It is not perfect, but there's much more protection to the worker versus in Kenya, where they would not care whether the fuel prices has gone up, you're still going to be charged the same amount. And sometimes it has become such a poverty trap for these gig workers who want to get any sort of employment, take loans, buy assets in order to be able to participate in these activities, but then end up in debt, in huge debt, because the algorithms and how the pricing is done does not take into account their economic well-being. So it is a huge issue that is very convoluted. That is, ranges from policymakers to labor laws to skills to increasing the bargaining power of workers. But I think all that underpins on one thing, which is the narrative. All right. And I think that is an important thing that needs to be addressed, that gig work needs to stop being brought to the table as cheap labor. Workers in Africa need to stop being brought to the table as cheap labor. And there needs to be equitable ways of saying between labor and capital, the person bringing the labor, the person bringing the capital needs to come to the table in a very fair way at the design process to build platforms that will result in a win-win situation where, yes, we create jobs, yes, we put our skills and our time into good use, but also it becomes a pathway for economic growth for the individuals. I feel like I've said many things, but yeah, in a nutshell, that's what the research was about. And we also, had a few recommendations, mostly for policymakers, because this is a time that most African countries are developing this digital labor policies, and it's important that the voice of the workers is considered in a much greater way while making the decisions.
Wow, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I remember I was in Uganda late last year, and the fuel prices had gone from around 5,000 Ugandan shillings to around 6,500, which was about a 30% increase. But the algorithms on the ride-hailing apps I was using as well, it completely stayed the same. So I was talking to some of the drivers, and they were just saying it's not profitable now to even be on the road, and take these jobs. What the research you've covered and what you've mentioned, it seems to be very much a multi-dimensional problem that we're facing here. So the question is really, what can be done? So where do you see the future of jobs in Africa? I know that's a very difficult question to answer, and we might be here all day, but what would you like to see in terms of the future of the gig economy and the future of jobs in general in Africa?
Yeah, I think my dream, if I had a dream, a dream opportunity, it would be a future where we are designing a solution to youth unemployment that we are not, that the workers are not coming to that table as victims. or they're not coming to that table without power, as a a challenge that needs to be solved, but they are coming to the table, and we are making consideration of labor as a very important resource that should be able to negotiate and to bargain for the best possible deal. And what that means is, for policymakers, they are not just saying, whatever it takes to bring more jobs. We don't care what kind of jobs. We don't care how much those jobs pay. Any job is a good job, because it's better than nothing. So a place where we are debunking that narrative, and we're looking at labor as a resource that should be respected, as a resource that deserve everybody on the table, to give them a fair chance and a fair voice in the design of what the future of jobs in Africa would look like. So I for me, in a nutshell, it would be good jobs, not any jobs, not many jobs, but good jobs, fair jobs, where people get a fair wage for the amount of work and effort that they bring to the table.
Thanks so much, Jerioth. I think this has been a very, very insightful episode. I think our audience, with many of them based on the continent, are going to take a lot of learnings from this. A question I asked to all of my guests on the show is that if you had your own social impact journal and you had one page to write, what advice would you give to a change maker? So I think the question I would ask for your page in the book is, what piece of advice would you give to a young student in a university on the continent who is about to head into the world of work?
Oh, wow. I would say, be authentic. Be authentic. Bring your authentic self to the world. In a world where it is easier to mimic what other, the paths of other people, and to look up to people who have done things successfully and just copy paste that. Dare to be your authentic self, and dare to be not necessarily different, but true to yourself. I think I generally say to especially people who go into social development specifically, because that's the line I am in. It's a blessing to get a job, but if you're going to do exactly what has been done in the past, this is why these social issues are not being solved, because we are just repeating the mistakes that were done in the past. We are repeating, as I said, the geopolitical mistakes that we did when, negotiating trades, in the 60s is what we are repeating now in the digital age. And that cloning and repeating and not being authentic and not bringing fresh and true ideas has been, in my opinion, the challenge in social development. So I think I would love to see the new kids in the block coming into this space, coming with fresh new ideas and authentic ideas.
That's a great piece of advice. And I think if you want to connect with Jerioth, her social media handles have been running down the bottom of the screen for those watching on YouTube. For those listening in on one of the audio platforms, then they'll be in the show notes, along with some links for further reading on the topic. Jerioth, thanks so much for joining me on the Social Impact Journal. I think it's been one of my favorite episodes. I've learned a lot personally. I'm sure our audience will as well. And if you want to get in touch with Jerioth, as I mentioned, her social media tags are there on the bottom of the screen.
Thank you very much, Jack. And I have to say to you, thank you for using your platform to do social good. I think there are a lot of people who don't, appreciate how few of us get platforms to influence. And the fact that you've chosen to use your platform to spread good and to spread word about social good is really great. So thank you for doing this.